Hi, and once again, we are here on Living in the 21st Century. Joining me today is Dr. Julius Dudley, a former professor, a champion of education, and a historian. Doctor, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. And one of the questions I want to ask you, I know that we are in Black History Month, but before it was Black History Month, we had the Negro Week. Could you tell us what is the evolution or derivatives from that week to now Black History Month?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me back to your program.
Sure.
I certainly will address that issue because it's one of special interest to me. Black History Month initially started out as Negro History Week.
Okay.
But there were reasons why that there were needs to set up such a special week to celebrate Negroes. During the earlier part of the 20th century, the word Negro was used quite commonly, and the word colored.
Okay.
The words African, African American, Black American, Afro American were not particularly in vogue.
Right.
There were certain political, social reasons, the milieu of the times dictated a different designation.
Yes.
But I didn't answer to your question. Throughout much of the history of this country, people of color, Black people, frequently called Africans during the 1790s in this country, they were called Africans,
Yes.
were associated with Africa as being inferior people, people who had limited so-called intellectual capacity, if not nothing but brutes, worthy to be sold. And the laws of the country so characterized them as being chattel. People, persons enslaved,
Yes.
rather than calling themselves slaves, they were virtually enslaved. And many of the people who were enslaved took it upon themselves to explain themselves,
Yes.
to talk about their experiences. So Negro History Week, or say Negro History Month, now African American History, or say African
Yes.
American History Month. All of this evolved because of the various conditions that existed within the country that we now call America.
Yes.
So many of the early scholars, persons who were literate, wrote about their own experiences, and fortunately, a number of well-meaning, courageous white people and scholars began to question this whole image of Africa being inferior, a land of darkness, where there was nothing of value. And I know this from personal experience, living in Georgia.
Right.
When we studied world history, they only had 2 or 3 pages on Africa, and it was entitled Africa, Africa, the Dark Continent. And there were only about 6 or 7 paragraphs. This was a course entitled World History.
Yes.
And there was about 1 or 2 pages, maybe 4 pages set aside for Asia. Just a smidgen about South Korea and other Asian people.
Right.
Very little that was said about Eastern Europeans. But the history of the world was primarily Eurocentric, Western Eurocentric, and that was considered to be world history. when I grew up in this country. I was born in 1944.
Okay.
This was before segregation was designated as being unconstitutional. Brown
Yes.
versus Board of Education. I was 10 years old. The passage of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. I was 20 years old.
Okay.
I was quasi-free. But my parents, grandparents, and great-great-grandparents were born in this country, and I can trace my ancestral roots back to the 1790s,
Okay.
possibly as early as the 1770s. Most black, or say enslaved people, did not ask to come to this country as immigrants.
That's right.
They were forcibly taken and brought to this country and made to work as pure economic units
Right.
to generate wealth. Now, much of this explains the reason why people were enslaved. Economics, which came first? The economic reasons or
Right.
social reasons? Which came first, the hen or the egg? Scholars have dealt with this issue. Carl Dagler and other historians, Winthrop Jordan. There's a host of people who've dealt with these issues of the genesis of us enslaved
Right.
people of color. Now, I could talk about this subject for the next 4 or 5 months.
Yes.
For those of you who are not aware of the fact that I have a PhD in history from the University of Cincinnati. I have an area of specialization in black history. Also tutor student England
Yes.
and the American West. But my focus academically has been
Yes.
in the area of recent American history.
Yes.
My dissertation dealt with
Right.
mob violence, race relations, etc. I've published, but I've also been involved in other such activities, such as sending books to South Africa and other countries in Africa, Angola,
Right.
and to a less extent sending books to the areas of the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and a few other places.
Right.
But in my journey, I found out that black history is not only celebrated in America, but in Ireland, in Great Britain, and several other foreign countries. So there are people throughout the world who want to know more about African American,
Right.
African history and culture. And so it was Carter G. Woodson, in answer to your question, who organized the Negro History Week.
Right.
It was first celebrated in 1926, not in a few months ago. You know, said this has been around for a fair number of
For a long time,
years.
Yes.
But before he set up the Negro History Week, he organized a group called the Association for the Study of Negro History and Culture at Howard University in 1915. Subsequently, he created a publication called the Journal of Negro History. He, being a Harvard graduate, majoring in history, he realized the value of creating this history in order to, in many instances, create self-esteem.
Right.
When the world was telling people of color, you're nothing, you made no contributions, you came from Africa, and Africa had nothing to offer. It was designated as a dark continent. There were scholars
Right.
who worked with public school teachers throughout the South to infuse, to help integrate scholarly knowledge in the public school systems, because the school systems were primarily controlled by white corporate interests
Right.
and white corporate educators who wanted to do what? Perpetuate this image, to keep black students in tune with their, that is, to keep them in tune with the mission of the ruling class.
Right.
You're ignorant, you can accomplish nothing, you're a failure, you're going to always be a failure.
Right.
So, these scholars had publications, they used the black press to help educate black teachers who had to teach Negro History Week as a sideline in the classroom when they would give us textbooks. And I tell you, from personal experience, I got a textbook in world history that was published here in Boston, Hope Mifflin. Published in Boston, that had all of these negative images about people of color. Africa, dark continent, place of superstition, savages, difficult to find, illnesses.
But you sorry for crossing, but you know what really amazes me though? How come Africa is so negative, has nothing to offer, and you took all your energy to get ships? In those days, they didn't even have engines. They had to use sails that would take them a long treacherous right up to Africa to get Africans to bring to this country to work as slaves. And we know for a fact, whether they didn't want to educate us socially or make us feel apart socially, it was for all economic enrichments. Simple and straightforward as that.
And therefore, you must come up with rationales and justifications for doing something that is unchristian, something that is morally and ethically wrong,
Yes.
and at the same time find a creative way to feel good about yourself at the expense of others. Now, this was done by scholars
Right.
to teach teachers to more or less combat that which they had to use in their textbooks that ran counter to the truth.
Right.
In the textbooks, it stated something very clearly. And students, like most of us, see something in writing, we consider it the gospel.
Yes.
But these teachers said to me, well, that isn't exactly true now. We're in the classroom. All black teachers, all black schools, black principals. But the Board of Educations in Georgia were all white. They were the ones who
Yes.
made the selections of the books, found ways to hire all the teachers and the principals. And this is how institutional racism perpetuates
Yes.
racism even to this very day. But you had these organizations in place that would say, this isn't quite true. This is not true.
Right.
You had black fraternities and sororities, people who were of college training, people who had graduated from universities and colleges, primarily historically black universities
Yes.
and colleges, institutions of higher learning. One such group was Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity. It was established in 1915. They had a number of people who would organize the history, do the research, organize the history, and spread it among their followers. This organization was primarily African American.
Yes.
Today, it's inclusive, like all black organizations have been inclusive. People like Hosea Williams, people like John Lewis, one of the icons of the civil rights movement. People like Kwame Nkrumah,
Yes.
a student at Lincoln University became president of Ghana. You had other Africans or people of color who joined Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. This organization is very inclusive.
Yes.
Even now, Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton, is a member of Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. It has opened its doors to people of all colors and all ethnic backgrounds, persons who are Dominican, Spanish-speaking, and even Asians.
Right.
It was a historical black organization to help build pride, to help promote Black History Week
Yes.
and that Black History Month, to celebrate the contributions of people of color. Their members, like George Washington Carver, the great scientist, who was committed
Right.
to the promotion of black education, and black education that was not miseducation,
Right.
which was fed to most Americans, but it took a cadre of people, of scholars and teachers in the small towns to say, this isn't quite right.
That's
There were books published, but they had been ignored by the mainstream. By the year 1915, when racial segregation was at its zenith, nobody wanted to read anything about black scholars, you know, the larger white community. Reconstruction was generally perceived as a failure. Even those who had held power in South Carolina, they were constantly criticized by the white corporate structure of America. Segregation was at its zenith in 1915. People were segregated from the cradle to the grave.
Yes.
For the first time in American history since the Civil War, you had a Southerner who was President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who endorsed a movie called Birth of a Nation, which praised the existence of the Klan and
Yes.
blackface. He also promoted racial segregation, Jim Crow laws, to the level of the White House. Federal employees, for the first time by 1915, were separated.
Yes.
So there was no other time in the history of the country that this had happened. Even when I was born in 1944, I was listed among all of the black children who were born in Atlanta.
Right.
And for the next 20 years, I would read the Atlanta Constitution that published all the black children and the white children,
Yes.
white births, colored births. There were job sections, colored jobs and white jobs.
Yes.
If I had gone to the courthouse, they had a separate Bible to swear on for blacks and whites. It was a total, complete system.
Yeah.
And at the time of death, you were to be buried at Lincoln Cemetery, not at Southwest, another cemetery designated for whites. To be sure, some mistakes were made along the way. But you need to understand
Yes.
that it was a total system. And also
Right.
bear in mind, and the audience should always be clear about this, Jim Crowism was a northern invention. There were a few instances where you had slavery in southern cities, a book written by Jackson. But the strange career of Jim Crow says that it was primarily a northern invention. And even in places like Boston, you had separate school systems, and blacks following the American Revolution had to sue for their freedom. So when they came up with the notion of doing Negro History Week,
Right.
and later it was expanded to Negro History Month,
Yes.
in 1976, about 50 years later,
Okay.
the whole notion expanded to a point, as I said earlier, that Negro History Month in different countries around the world. Negro History Month is inclusive.
Right.
How many biracial children who pass for white
Yes.
and who are white in appearance
Yes.
can embrace Negro History Month? And also, white Americans can embrace Negro History Month because this is the history of America.
Of course it is.
And if you want to take it further, it's the history of the world.
Yes, I love that because not only is it just the history of America, both white Americans and black Americans alike has to acknowledge that the very economic foundation of this country were built off the freedom of slavery. And that's why there's still that elite group and their descendants who try to maintain that within their political atmosphere, and it filtrates right down into some of the police forces. And that's why I think you will still find unarmed black men getting gunned down, or a cop trying to plant a weapon in a black man's hand who never had one in the first place, or shoot him in his back in the first place. I can remember the Wild West. If you shoot a man in the back,
You're considered a coward.
and they took you back and they hang you for that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there should be laws in place still that anyone who shoot an unarmed person should be condemned for murder. It doesn't matter if they're a criminal or not, that they should be condemned for murder.
All of human life is valuable. That's my core feeling. When I look at you or meet anyone, I see a little bit of myself in everyone.
Yes.
And therefore, I value everyone.
Yes.
Because I am like them and they are like me.
Of course.
And we all bring something special to the table by virtue of the fact we have human qualities.
That's right.
If we would only prove to be a little tad bit more patient,
Yes.
if not inquisitive, about others, we could learn so much more.
Yes.
The secret of a long and comfortable life is giving
Naturally.
and sharing. Just think how good you feel when you give something
That's
of
true.
value
That's
to
true.
others.
That's
That's one reason why I enjoyed sending over 3 million books to underserved schools and
Beautiful.
libraries in Africa. I age, but not as fast as others because I enjoy
you age
giving
gracefully.
and gracefully, with joy in my
Yes.
heart.
What words would you want to leave, not just the black people, but as American as a whole, when it comes to Black History Month? What would you like to leave to the American culture as a whole when it comes to Black History Month?
I would like to say to you, we celebrated the birthday of a prominent person from New Bedford, Massachusetts, Dr. Leonard F. Morse. He was a member of Phi Beta Sigma fraternity and then one of the organizers.
Okay.
And that he was largely forgotten. But this thing, through his efforts, all those prominent people I mentioned who joined Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, it first began in Massachusetts.
Right.
A man who had a vision. And that he was a firm believer in Black History Month. He believed that it was there for all of us.
Yes.
It's there for all of us to enrich our understandings about our fellow human beings. And if we have a better understanding and a better appreciation and a deeper appreciation, the chances are less likely we will maintain the current level of racism that's in the country. We don't have to blame Donald Trump for this, because there were at least 60 some odd million people who voted for him.
Yes.
He's not by himself. He just only channeled
Right.
a stream of thought that exists. So I say to you, when we learn more about one another, the chances are better that we will learn to love one another and see the human value and the spiritual, as well as the spiritual value
Yes.
that exists among all of us, and we will become a better people.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, we're running down on the last 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask you this one question.
Sure.
What do you think every black person needs to know about their ancestors and the fight that got them here to this point? What you think they should know?
They should learn to appreciate that they struggle,
Yes.
that people have given so much to create a better life
Yes.
for ourselves. With the establishment of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, Richard Allen fought for this. He didn't want to be taken from the church.
Right.
He wanted to be a part of the Episcopal Church. But he and other free black people recognized the value that whites as allies contributed. The African Methodist Episcopal Church set up one of the first black universities in America for black people. But it was named in order of Wilberforce,
Okay.
who had fought against the African slave trade. He was a parliamentarian in London.
Beautiful.
So even if you hear the word African, black, and not to be intimidated by this, you should embrace it.
Exactly.
Because we are part of the same human family, and our histories are as one.
And on that note, I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Dudley, for being here again, explaining a little more on African American Month, and to all those who are out there, I hope you did enjoy this program, and there will be many more times where Dr. Dudley will be here on this program discussing more about black history and so forth. So until then, take good care and enjoy. Bye-bye.
I've got a job to do today.
I've got a job to do today.
Have a good first day at work, Mom.
Your donations to Goodwill fund job training programs right in your community.
Feels good to start fresh, right?
Sure does.
And like that, you're a job creator.